Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sensafili Sparring Partners. This is Monica Paolini from Sensafili, and I'm your podcast host. And today we have a follow-up episode. So I promise that all the episodes would be half an hour, and I found a way to cheat right away. So we have the second episode with Press Marshall. Press is the Director of Wireless Standards and Policy at Google, and he also works at the WIN Forum and the OnGo Alliance, where he's working on CBRS. And in the first episode, we talked about Preston's new book, Evolution to 6G. We're going to keep doing it. We're going to continue doing that, but we're going to talk about different issues. So in the first initial episode, we talked more about monetization and coexistence with Wi-Fi. Great topics, but it's only part, especially a small part of the book. If you remember, and if you haven't followed, I would suggest you just listen to that first, is Press claim that we should focus more, as we move to 6G, we get more focus on the core functionality and actually, exploit it all. And I think that, what is clear is that oftentimes we think of the core as in a sort of it's kind of more restricted way. It's kind of like, and it used to be like, the kind of thing that it's kind of boring and that you need to have in order to get the network working, but it's actually, it's doing much more. And especially as we move to 5G with a standalone core, it's a much more powerful core. And there is a press argument is that we can do even more with 6G. So maybe a good point to get started again, Press, is to talk about, why should we think more about the core? And it's not just network slicing, right?
Yeah. Well, don't walk away from network slicing. Everyone else has, but we shouldn't. The core is what defines the user experience, whether the user experience is a factory and its numerical control machines or the experiences for consumers. As we build out the RAN, as we have essentially ubiquitous coverage for where most of us live, really where cellular can differentiate itself, where it has to differentiate itself, is in those features in the core. In going from 4G, the 4G core served the RAN. That's all it did. It made the RAN work. It wasn't really, with the exception of authentication, it really didn't do anything that someone would think of paying for. With 5G, I think the 3GPP community made a great leap in looking at the core as independently monetizable. With slicing, the slicing you'd so diminish, and with network capability exposure, which I think is equally exciting. But the fact of the matter is that the consumers of cellular right now, our consumers, really don't need those features. The cellular experience with or without their augmentation is sufficient. There's no real incentive for the services that run to that cell phone to invest in them. I don't want to. I'm from Google, but this book doesn't represent Google, and it's not really coordinated in any way with any Google product or desires. But when I talk to people, who are building these very large scale, literally multi-billion user systems across the world, they really can't afford to pay even a couple cents per operator per user back to operators. And then you end up with a differentiated experience. It works well for these customers. It doesn't work well for these. You kind of have to build these services to the lowest common denominator. And that lowest common denominator is probably not in the United States. It's probably overseas. So clearly the hyperscalers haven't rushed in to fund these features. I honestly believe the people who have the incentive to do this is in the private network space, industrial automation, those kind of applications. On the other hand, the 3GPP community really hasn't reached out to them and said, let us think about how private enterprises can deploy this technology in a scalable manner. Scaling always meant going bigger and bigger nationally. It didn't mean going from a national network down to a single factory or an academic campus. So we really need to reattack scaling, and the place we should do that is in the core. Radios are linear. It's the core and the complexity and the naming frameworks and all of those overheads that are unique to 3GPP, where we have the opportunity to create these new bill payers.
Yeah. And so, and that's the new thing about, well, one of the new things about the 5G core is that it can support any access technology, any G, Wi-Fi, and anything really. So it's technology and access technology agnostic. And so that is great. However, so that's the technology part. That part has kind of been downplayed, and you don't hear people talk much about it. And I think that there is kind of an inherent issue here because you have 3GPP creating this thing that is amazing, right? But it's driven by mobile operators and vendors that sell to them. And so is 3GPP the right body to do that? And even if it is, should it change the way it operates to fit this new reality? But then again, are the mobile operators and those vendors willing to really be, because it might not just serve their own financial goals?
Yeah, I run two standard development organizations. I'd hate to tell a third one what they should do, but the, there are potentially contrary interests in the 3G, in any standards group. There's contrary interests, but certainly in 3GPP. And I think that comes about from thinking about private networks. Um, when we went into 5G, I think there was an assumption that factories would buy these slices from the public network operators, and that would be the way they would build private networks. Um, whether you think that was a good idea or a bad idea, it certainly hasn't happened to any extent. Um, so people, if they're going to invest 7 billion in a factory, then they want to have control over the core means of production of that factory. So a couple of $100 million to build their own network is not significant compared to the sovereignty it gains. So I don't think it was a realistic assumption to imagine that that partnership would emerge, particularly with some of the bad experiences with the shutdown of 2G and 3G, and we'll be nearing soon a shutdown on 4G, where it's very clear to private networks that might have 30-year amortized equipment that they really can't depend on public networks. So whether these should be forces or not, I think they are, and I think we have to recognize them. Um, and frankly, they have a competitor. If you're the cellular guys, I think of themselves as their own competitors. Their real competitor is Wi-Fi. Their real competitor is sitting at Best Buy at $90 a box, upgraded every 2 years with cool technology. Just got 1.2 gigahertz of free spectrum in the United States. Is getting maybe 500, 600 megahertz around most of the world. That's a pretty tough competitor. So making peace, so the choices are two: make peace with them and bring them into the family, and think of the core business that can integrate separately from the RAN business, um, or watch the relevance of this continue to essentially flatline. We see growth in sort of the Wi-Fi community. If you go through a lot of the documents that drive 3GPP, in my book, I use the Next Generation Mobile Network Alliance 5G study, and I use the Next Generation Alliance 6G study use cases. You look at those, and they're exciting, but they're not necessarily, by default, they don't go to mobile operators. In gaming, really advanced gaming, I think that's done indoors. I think 99% of the gaming that goes on in America is done over Wi-Fi, and it's the cable industry that supplies it. Factories, right now it is Wi-Fi. Maybe it'll change, but certainly Wi-Fi is the incumbent technology there. go through all those use cases. Some outdoor transportation, yes, cool one. Not so good in America because we just don't use we don't use transportation here, public transportation, but certainly relevant one in Europe. Um, but most of those use cases don't clearly by default go to public operators. So I think the supply chain has to think about where its future lies. It's talked a lot about private networks, but until it brings those requirements into its standards, it's largely talk. I mean, we in CBRS, when I go around and I've tried to talk to people who didn't deploy CBRS, I can talk to people who did, they love it. But I've gone and I spent half a year ago, I spent a lot of time talking to people who hadn't deployed it to find out why. You guys were enthused, you talked about it, you haven't done much. Some of those became spectrum policy issues. We worked them, they're part of CBRS 2.0, massive results on that. That 80, 90% reduction in interference for most users, up to 98%. Great, we solved a lot of those blockers. The remaining blockers largely come around to the difficulty in approaching to GBP for private networks.
Yeah, but
And
so
they're not issues necessarily for Verizon, but they are for a factory.
yeah.
Doesn't scale down. In my book, I lay out several areas where I think that needs to be attacked. Authentication. No one else in the world uses symmetric keys. Everyone in the industry uses credentials. Identity is established. Avoiding imposter networks, which cellular hasn't done. That's why we have stingrays out there. Imposter devices. None of these problems are solved anywhere near the standards that enterprises demand.
So, so there is one thing that the 3GPP doesn't really include the enterprise as stakeholders in an explicit way. So they just kind of sneak in, if anything, through the vendors, and that might be an issue. But also 3GPP with this kind of like long cycle, the releases, the generations, when we have everything that changes on very quickly in anything else, uh, is it the right pace?
I mean, let's think about how many products do you have that have 10-year product cycles? Even dishwashers and dryers seem to be faster than that. So now, I mean, 3GP made sense if you had a hardware EPC, maybe because it was a piece of hardware. But now you've put half of your foot in the cloud, in the core. The cloud principle is continuous integration, continuous deployment. I don't have G's. I think I mentioned in the last one of our chats, there's no such thing as Gmail generation 1, generation 2, Facebook generation 1, generation 2. They are continually improved. I don't want to hold myself out for big releases. We do Apple, Google, Samsung do once a year cell phone software refreshes with major releases. So yeah, maybe it made sense. It made sense to think about that when you viewed the RAN as what drove your schedule. So if you think that my job as a standards body is to design RANs, and then, oh, by the way, I need a control plane for it, every 10 years makes sense. If you think that, gee, my product is the control plane, and I want to support as much types of RAN and as many diverse customers as I can, then 10 years makes no sense.
Yeah.
A standards body of any one community doesn't make a lot of sense. If you want the bill payers to come in, I mean, when I look at like advanced gaming, 5G is going to make money from advanced gaming. Did they talk to Microsoft or Sony? Say, what would it take for you guys to actually share some of your margin with us? And I expect the answer is there's nothing you can do for me. But I don't think that question was even asked because you're asking someone else to share their margin. And so if you haven't asked them, then you really don't know if they'll do it at all. And you certainly don't know what to build. What would be the key thing cellular could do that could enable Microsoft to sell more Xbox? Or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think anyone asked that question. What would Google just die to have to make outdoor maps fundamentally a differentiable product? Again, I doubt anyone was asked. And the answer might be no, in which case, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Certainly no one asked private networks.
No, absolutely. And yeah, there's a lot of, but let's just that could be, another topic for another hour or two, but let's
You
go
only do
back
half
to,
hour at a time.
yes. Let's go back to the actually the spectrum part, because in order for you to have a private network, a cellular private network, because Wi-Fi is a private network too, but uses unlicensed. Then if you want to have a CBRS type of network, you need to have spectrum. So how should we think about it in terms of new spectrum allocations, and especially as we go up in frequency? Because the way I see it is like the higher the frequency is, we know the limitations of microwave. It doesn't go that far. So does it make sense to license it on a national basis, or even on a link basis? Wouldn't it be better to just have it on a square footage area, like which becomes a real estate play, so that you as an enterprise have the right to use it in that location as they start using it in Europe, which is kind of complicated in its own way, but it's more like, or in a CBRS kind of style, which is not unlicensed but not licensed either, so it's like protected, right?
Yeah.
So how should we think about spectrum allocation in order to encourage more private networks, more indoor coverage?
Yeah, it's unfortunate and I start with saying how unfortunate it's in the US, but the US is better than really any other country in the world in terms of flexible spectrum policy. CBRS is not a nation in the world that is within orders of magnitude of the flexibility that CBRS has been afforded to do local licensing. Europe has local licensing, but you still have to go to a regulator and ask Mother, may I? And there are pukas and all kinds of people who can say no, and the regulators retain control, even though it's more flexible. So yes, I think the problem is in the United States, we saw in 3.1, 3.45 spectrum sharing that it came down to almost a bifurcated discussion between cellular exclusive use, major economic area model on one side, and a CBRS-like model. I don't think in the unlicensed showed a lot of interest in this stuff. In 6 gig, it's most of the world. It's a fight between the exclusive use cellular model and totally free use and unlicensed. It would be good if the participants in the larger 3GPP ecosystem saw that what that does is it freezes out these private networks and pushes them in. If you want to think of them as warring camps for their business, it pushes them into the Wi-Fi camp. Unless they're in the United States, there's really no way to run CBRS without an agreement with a mobile operator and an agreement in which you have absolutely no leverage. So again, I think it comes down to the supply chain in 3GPP looking ahead to see where are their opportunities. I know where the opportunities for steady state are, but where are the opportunities for growth? They have a very desirable technology, but it comes with a lot of encumbrances. And spectrum is certainly one of them. Obviously, and it's interesting. In the United States, everybody thinks CBRS was like the spectrum reform. It actually was put together by the National Economic Council because they saw that kind of activity creating economic activity and growth and new product development. And I think that was the right model. It wasn't about spectrum at all. It's about creating new industries. And so how do people who are very much a part of one industry and beholden to that industry think about opening up a product to the architectural competitors of that industry?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge to the major supply chain players. They don't do it. Their core is there's open source versions now. There's certainly opportunities for this to happen outside of 3GPP, like ORAN, where that said, okay, I'm going to be compliant around the edges, but I'm going to rebuild the internal allocations. In my book, I kind of make an argument that if you look at the framework of that 3GPP design for the service-based architecture core, it's beautifully architecturable into any number of variants. It'd be much more appropriate for private networks, Wi-Fi. I think I called out specifically security, authentication, identity, cryptography as areas where you could just essentially swap, and RAN itself, abstraction. You could have come in there. So it doesn't have to be done in 3GPP. That's, I mean, that those companies keep laying people off.
Yeah.
They can,
But
start to say,
hold on, but there's also the other thing. It's like 6 gigahertz. We often think of it now open for Wi-Fi, but 5G could use it too, and presumably 6G. So, but nobody's really talking about it. So
no,
it's not like, I mean, because that would be a perfect place where you can do
it was
mind
hard to get,
jamming.
it was hard to get 3GPP to agree to CBRS, which is actually
Yeah.
licensed.
Yeah.
You can't get PLMN numbers, which are the public land mobile network radios. Eventually, we got a number that Ongo Alliance sells out in order to build build SIM cards. But the requirement for that is you have a license. So there are institutional obstacles to the idea of this. Of course, we saw LTEU, which got into a large fight over the LBT and all, and kind of disappeared. We have Multi-Fire Alliance, but there hasn't been a lot of take up of those because they're trying to make 3GPP like Wi-Fi. And so I think in my book, I'd argue that that's making a cat into a dog. What you want to do is make the architecture friendly to the systems that are designed around those assumptions, rather than trying to build your own version of Wi-Fi or your own version of that has no volume, no production volume.
But then again, I mean, that you need to make it feasible, and like the numbering system, and so the phone number idea and the SIM card were obviously developed for public cellular networks. As I say, that the whole thing that the CBRS is just a big hack in the sense that you need to have the CBRS, the Ongo Alliance.
Yeah, you keep talking like that, I'm leaving. It's not a
No,
big
well,
hack.
no, but no, it's necessary, right? So
Yeah, it's the
but
first
it's
of a.
not. How can I say? It's not an ideal way to solve the problem. It's not friendly to the enterprise, and so how should we think about it? And isn't that the phone number kind of like an obsolete idea when I'm just using? I mean, it doesn't matter how I'm connected. The phone number, they say it becomes my identity, but should it be? It's kind of like using the social security number for that. Is that really the best way? Not really.
It's I mean, I've sort of made an argument that we don't in the book. We don't really need to have to worry about telephone numbers because they are relatively irrelevant to most people. We text using direct messaging tools, Google's, Facebook's, whatever, and they use arbitrary identities that are authenticated by real cryptography and certificates and all by the cloud. That works pretty well. It runs over the top. There's nothing that's unique in 3GPP anymore that doesn't exist in an over the top cloud service. When we started 3GPP, we started CBRS. A lot of the people who came in to start it were all 3GPP people, and I'm not one. I mean, my background was really different kind of networks, and they kept pounding. I mean, no, the reason we can't do this is we have all these unique features in the phone that makes phone calls better or makes messaging better. Well, the fact is, no one uses those anymore. We use over-the-top voice. We're talking to you over the top.
Right.
We use Wi-Fi calling as the final surrender for indoors. We use DMing tools that are identity-based, Slack, whatever. And so there's nothing in that 3GPP RAN anymore that is related to any unique service. The telephone numbers went away. I mean, they mean a lot in other parts of the world. But I think clearly the good news is we don't have to bring all that infrastructure with us as we think about how to build these new networks, because they probably don't need it. I'm not going to give a numerical control machine a telephone number.
So
Give it a MAC number.
we can move forward. I mean, especially for like IoT, like all the sensors and stuff. I mean, to have each one of them have a SIM card seems
Kind of
overkill.
embarrassing. Yeah, I
And
don't
it's
want
not really the best way.
SIM cards means I have to have a private key store somewhere. It can't be hashed. You would never be able to get an enterprise to build security around pre-stored keys.
Yeah.
And fixed encryption. So yes, we would do it differently, and it would be considerably more robust. 3GPP should do it anyway. There's a GSMA study on new root of trust. A lot of people make money making SIM cards, but that whole system was designed to protect against cell phone fraud, where people were copying the codes and authorizing phone calls around the world. It protected revenue to operators. It was never intended to protect users. We've overloaded that telephone number like Social Security number, and given it massive impact on our financial lives. I mean, your bank account could be drained if someone could get your SIM card. It was never intended for that. It's not robust enough. So we need to move on. Identifier space. When I go private networks, there are in the numbering structure, there's 1,100 numbers in the United States. Some countries only have 100. We have 1,000, approximately 1,000 in the United States, but there's millions of companies that would want to be private networks. So the numbering system doesn't work. We need to go, but we have a numbering system. It's called domain names, and it's got copyright protection. It's got certificates, it links. We have a whole ecosystem to protect identifiers. That's evolved, merged to the internet, and it's constantly maintained every year. People find issues and get them fixed in IETF and World Wide Web. So we have good solutions to all these things. We don't have to bring over all of them. In fact, I don't think we want to bring over all of them.
So I guess that the way to think about it is that as soon as the core is, and it has the sort of capability to do that, and hopefully better even with 6G, to open up to these alternative ways, the kind of impact that the mobile phone or the SIM card might kind of taper off, which doesn't mean that we have to exclude it. It's just going to be coexisting. So we have different ways to authenticate, to establish trust and security. So I guess that's going to be the most likely path. And it already started because, as you say, I mean, I have a phone without a SIM, and it works pretty much as well as the other. I can do pretty much everything.
It should deeply bother. Yes, I do too. As a matter of fact, it should deeply bother people that, in fact, that's possible, because that really demonstrates that the Wi-Fi ecosystem, driven not so much by the Wi-Fi world, but by the hyperscalers, who had to work around the limitations of the telecom company. So they built their own over the top. They built their own video service. They built their own ways of managing video content around what telcos did. They build authentication that goes end to end, so they don't have to trust the telcos. So when you deal with your Google or Facebook account, it's strongly authenticated with a certificate and such on your phone. When someone does SMS with you, it's very weakly authenticated with no one happened to flip your SIM card at a local store that day. So essentially, people have built around this anyway. So there's an entire ecosystem that can work around 3GPP. It's available, even if I don't use all the unique support to that's in the RAN radios.
Yeah.
It served a good purpose. I mean, look, it got us where we are. There's nothing, no one did anything wrong, but now we have much greater ecosystems to do these things.
Yeah, I guess, and it's great to have a core that would support all of this in a centralized fashion, so that you don't need to have a different core for something else.
I mean,
The
you could follow this, and I don't do this in the book because it's way too radical to write, and I didn't want to detract from the sort of the immediacy. But um, if you think about an apartment complex with 20 odd stories, 10 units, there's 200 people there, all independently buying some cable service, a gigabit or something. They're independently running a Wi-Fi network. They're independently running network address translators, security, and all that stuff. When all they really want is to be immersed in Wi-Fi. And so, why does that make sense? I've got an access point against one wall, someone else has an access point on the other side, and we just do that because of security. I mean, it's the only rationale for having our own Wi-Fi network is security and accounting for traffic. So if you start to think about this core as having the ability to control multiple technologies, then I sort of buy bandwidth from somebody, and it gets delivered perhaps by Comcast Wi-Fi's at some point because it's a roaming. I'm roaming onto Comcast when my device comes in the apartment, and I'm roaming onto Verizon when I go outside. But it's a seamless experience. It's not like I have a network here with these restrictions, a network here or there, and so ultimately, having some common cores allows us to think about what are the different wholesale providers of networks, but integrate the retail experience considerably from what we have today. It really doesn't make sense for every one of us to be out becoming network operators. I can't stand all these things. There might be 1 million private network operators in 4 years. No, there's almost 1 billion now. Anyone with Wi-Fi.
No, absolutely. And yeah, it just make it so much easier again, to manage this whole thing, which is like now it puts a lot of burden on the individual user that doesn't want to know about any of
Yeah.
that.
And this is 6G is this is a good chance to pause because there's no one beating when 3G came along. I mean, let's face it, we all know 3G failed, right? I mean, it's accepted, but it may not be true, but it's accepted rubric. It's an odd G. By the time 3G was even beginning, the iPhone had come out. It was way behind. There was a massive pent-up bandwidth demand for 4G, and it was great. It came in, 4 times, 10 times more bandwidth, solved a lot of that. By and large, addressed the shortage of 3G. And in fact, we lived pretty well under 4G until 5G came out. 5G, okay, maybe that was the first bandwidth where there wasn't like pent-up first G without pent-up demand. Clearly, going into 6G, there's not a lot of pent-up demand. The argument is about use cases for 6G, not about bandwidth. So this is a chance to take a pause and kind of be a little more conceptual about what should all this stuff look like. All of these silos kind of emerged. Cable TV became cable modems. Telephone operators became wireless operators. There wasn't a lot of logic to it.
Yeah.
It evolved well. This is a chance for us to really think about what should it be like? What makes good business sense?
Yeah.
What will get the right investments?
Yeah, and I think that actually at the bottom of there's even a more sort of fundamental question about, the different, we always think of wireless versus wireline. The distinction doesn't make any sense anymore because every device we have, it's wireless at the edge, but wireline eventually. The sooner
Yeah,
the better. I mean,
yeah, the largest wireless suppliers essentially are cable guys.
right.
They just, they drop a fiber or drop a
In the
high-speed
US, yeah.
DOCSIS 4 pipe in your house, and
Yeah.
you connect to it. Some of
Yeah.
us are kind of old-fashioned. I still like to have Ethernet to things, but that's just because I like to see it in the 940 and my gigabit scale. It's unnecessary completely.
But I mean, yeah, for most people, you just don't,
Yeah.
because most of the devices don't even have an Ethernet plug. So even if you want to, you can do it. But it doesn't mean that it's wireless end to end, obviously.
Yeah, I mean,
Gets wireline as soon as possible
which
because it's more efficient.
comes back to we have these really arbitrary silos that have come about and made sense at the time we created the silo, but don't make sense today. And so you need some way to think of what's in common to all of them. I
And
think
we
the
need to think
architecture is
about what,
that
yeah,
could be the core.
and what is that makes sense and what is that doesn't make sense anymore, which is, as you say, it's conceptually. Again, we run out of time, and so it was great talking to you, Press. So
Always a pleasure.
and thank to all of you that are listening to this. Please do subscribe to the podcast if you like it, and let your friends know as well. Thank you very much.
Bye.